Hello everyone. We are going to talk about while loops today. So we've done the for loops already, and we are going to do an alternative, which is the controlled response loop. And if you remember from the very first loop video, this just means that instead of telling a loop how many times to go, we're just going to give it a condition that eventually, or hopefully, it will hit that condition and then end. So the mode of delivery in C# is the while loop. So let's take a look at it. And as you will see here, it only has one piece in its original line. So before we had the for, and then we had the initialization, the test, and the action. Here, the only thing you see is the test condition. So it looks, at first, it looks like it is going to be a simpler, but it's in the end you're going to realize that we actually have to have pretty much those three things even in a while. And so it's going to test, and if this condition is met, it's going to skip out of this. Or excuse me, if it's no longer met, it's going to jump out of it. So if we look at the I is less than 5, it's going to do the message box show high like we did in the last video, and then it's going to increment up. So now the incrementer is in the body, or the scope in this case, of the while loop, as opposed to up there in the header. The other thing is, remember last time we initialized it somewhere. Well, we don't really get out of that, because even though these four lines are all correct, it presupposes that I has already been created. So somewhere in your code you should have put int I equals 0 or something of that nature. You cannot initialize it inside this test condition, because remember what this means. It says it's asking the question, is I less than 5? Well, if you're initializing it there, you haven't really initialized it to anything. You'd have to say it int I equals 5 less than 5, which doesn't make sense from our standpoint or the C# standpoint when it goes through the compiler. So let's go take a look now at possibly how we can use this. So here's our last loop, our for loop, and I'm just going to leave it up there so we can use or get some info from it if we need to later on. And in fact, I might even do something as simple as this and put it in here. So we'll build it as if we're building that for loop, but in the while structure. So here's the keyword while. And then we cannot use this, but we could just copy this out, because remember, or actually I'll cut it out, because remember this is it's a statement in itself, because it already has the semicolon in there. So we could say int I 100. In fact, let's just keep it simple. Let's just go back to 0 like we were doing, and we'll count up to 10. And then likewise, this doesn't exist anymore, so really we have to strip this out, and we have to put this somewhere with the semicolon, and get rid of this semicolon. And let's go ahead, and we can do it by 2s, plus equal 2, just because we know what we're doing now. And we're going to add those hello to that same exact message box, excuse me, list box that we were using earlier. And this should run. Now, before I run, I'm going to point this out right here. If you've been adept and watch all the if videos, I'm sure you might have already realized that this is a Boolean, meaning that this statement actually comes down to being true or false. And you could put true in here, but if I put true in here, then guess what? This is going to fire off every time. If I put false in here, then it's going to be false every time, and it's going to skip over these two statements right here. Sometimes that's wanted because sometimes you have a kicker in here, and by a kicker I mean something that will kick you out of the scope. So you might have, if you remember from your switch statements, we could always just put a break in there if a certain condition is acquired. But there's also this fear that if you put the true in there, that this is going to be an infinite loop. And this is the problem with all of these, with the while loop especially. If you don't set this up correctly, this could easily turn into misfortune, because what happens if I did -2, right? Well, -2, it's going to start off at 0, going to print the hello, then it's going to say 0 minus 2 is -2. Well, -2, oops, and actually I changed the sign for this to make sense. -2 is less than 10. And then, so it goes to -4. Now that's less than 10. -6, well, that's less than 10 too. It will keep going forever, right? That is the problem with this while loop, is that you get the possibility of these infinite loops. And controlled responses are always a little bit more open to these than controlled number. Okay, so let's say we've done this correctly. So let's go ahead and hit start. And now we'll do the loop. And we have a large number of, oh, because I did my infinite loop. I left my infinite loop in there. Let's go ahead. Well, see, there's a good example. Let's go ahead and put the plus. What happened there was hung up, so it was continuing to go. But what C# and Visual Studio do is they put everything on the same thread. So when you push this button, let me just bring it over here, this loop button. When I press this loop button, they're all on the same thread. So what happens is it's writing to here, but it waits till it's done with that loop before it actually populates this list box. And the problem obviously is that if it's going on forever, it's never going to populate that list box. And that's why it showed that you're going to need a scroll bar, but it didn't actually have any entries in the list. So let's give this a try again. And we'll do the loop, and it does the hello. And just to make sure it's working correctly, I am going to put in back in our I. So hopefully this will go 0 to 8 by 2s, and it should work fine. And it's sure enough, it does. Now, what happens if I start off with this statement originally? If I is less than 10 or greater than 10, as you can see, it'll skip over this scope entirely. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because sometimes you do not want this to happen. So in other words, you might always want this scope to fire at least once. And if you do want that, then I would suggest doing what they refer to as a do while. So it's the same exact thing. As you can see, I've moved the while after the scope instead of before, and then I put the word do, which is another keyword, to go into here at least once. And so if that's the case, oops, let's see this. Oh, because I forgot the semicolon. And you do have to put the semicolon because this while, it doesn't have a scope after it, or traditionally whiles have things after them. In this case, what you're saying is we've paired it off with the do, so don't look below it for any other scope. So hit it, and as you can see, it only does the 0. So it does go through with it, even though I is never greater than 10 in here. And that can be used in various ways. You know, error checking is one way, is that you let everything go through at least once just to make sure it's going into the loop. I've done that before. There might be feedback to the user that allows them to see everything at least once. Okay, that sounds like a good wrap up for now. I'm going to make a short video with nested loops. I was going to start that here, but it actually makes more sense when I do it in the with a for loop. So why don't you, if you could, come back and see that. Thank you.